The morning in motion cracked open with smoke, sweat, and survival. Amarachi stood in front of her shop by the roadside, flipping akara in bubbling oil as the city stirred awake. Her wrapper clung to her skin, and her hairline glistened with heat, but her hands moved with rhythm. Every ball of akara dropped into her pan was a hope: school fees for Chidi, rent for their one room, face me, I face you, and maybe, if luck smiled, enough left for Gary. She was just 18, but her eyes had long forgotten what it meant to be a child. The street bustled with the familiar noise: conductors barking destinations, traders shouting prices, gospel music leaking from old speakers. Amarachi barely noticed. Her focus was on the sizzling pan and the growing line of customers. It was a normal morning until it wasn't. A sudden screech of tires pierced the air. A black Range Rover swerved violently, crashing into the edge of her stall. The wooden table broke apart, akara scattered on the ground, and hot oil spilled dangerously close to her feet. Gasps and curses erupted around her. Amarachi stood in shock, staring at the mess, her heart thudding painfully. From the car stepped a tall, handsome, dark-skinned young man in crisp white. His sunglasses caught the sun, and everything about him screamed wealth. He looked more irritated than apologetic. "Do you know what you just did?" Amarachi snapped, stepping forward. Her voice shook, but not from fear. Rage and disbelief burned in her chest. "That's my whole business. My only income?" Damilola froze. Her voice pulled him from his privileged bubble. Her eyes, sharp, teary, fierce, met his, and something twisted in his chest. He had faced shareholders, attended elite schools, and hosted glamorous parties, but nothing had ever struck him like the sight of this girl in a torn apron standing proud in the ruins of her mourning. "I'm sorry," he said, unsure if it was enough. It wasn't, but it was a start. The day after the accident, Amarachi kept her head low and her focus tighter. She returned to her regular spot early, armed with a borrowed wooden table and twice the caution. The previous day felt like a bad dream. One of those strange blurry days where your life collided with something so far removed from your reality, you began to doubt it happened at all. But it had happened. She had shouted at a rich boy. She had picked akara off the ground while his glossy car idled beside her. And she had seen something in his eyes. Surprise, maybe even shame, that stayed with her longer than she liked. Still, she didn't expect to see him again. So when the Range Rover pulled up near her stall the following morning, her hands froze mid-flip. But it wasn't the driver who stepped out. It was Damilola himself. No sunglasses, no designer jacket. Just jeans, a t-shirt, and a quiet look on his face. "You again?" she said, trying to keep her voice steady, arms crossed over her oil-stained apron. He offered a small, awkward smile. "I owe you an apology and a table." "I already replaced the table and the apology came yesterday." He hesitated. "Okay, but I brought you this." He pulled out a small bag, clean, white nylon, like the ones fancy restaurants use for takeaway. Amarachi stared at it. "I figured you might not have had time for breakfast," he said. She blinked. "So you came back to bring me food?" I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't stop thinking about what you said, about this being your whole livelihood. You were right. Amarachi didn't know whether to laugh or roll her eyes. You think akara sellers are used to being tracked down and handed designer food by boys in expensive cars? He rubbed the back of his neck. "Well, no, but I'm not most boys." She took the bag, more curious than anything. Inside was a paper-wrapped meat pie and a cold drink. "You didn't have to." "I know," he said, "but I wanted to." They sat on an overturned crate and shared breakfast in the shade, and to her surprise, the conversation didn't feel forced. He asked about her akara, how she learned the trade, where she sourced her beans, why she still used firewood instead of gas. "No one ever asks those things," she said quietly. "Maybe no one's ever cared enough." She looked at him for a long moment. He wasn't trying to be charming. He wasn't performing. He was just present, and that unnerved her more than anything. By the time the morning rush began, Damilola had rolled up his sleeves and started helping pass change to customers. Awkward at first, but willing. Amarachi couldn't stop glancing at him. What was he doing here? "Do you even know how much a ball of a curry costs?" she asked, half teasing. "Not yet," he grinned, "but I'm learning." Just before he left, he turned to her, more serious now. "I'll come by again, if that's okay?" She hesitated, then nodded slowly. "If you want to help, come early. We grind the beans at 5. He raised an eyebrow. 5 a.m.? You're not joking. Nope. Then I'll see you at 5. Later that evening, Amarachi lay on her mat staring at the ceiling, her mind looping around his words. No one had ever come back. People helped and disappeared. Or they helped with expectations. But he hadn't asked for anything. He just sat with her like a friend, like a human being. And that scared her more than anything else. Because the last thing she could afford was hope. But it had come anyway. The rest of Amarachi's day unfolded like a bad dream. Even after she returned home and dropped some money into Mama Chidi's worn-out enamel plate, her chest still felt tight. She didn't tell her siblings what happened, just said business had been fine. They danced around with joy at the unexpected abundance, but Amarachi sat by the corner, staring at her stained apron. She couldn't forget the way he'd looked at her, not with pity, but with a strange softness, like he saw her, and that scared her more than anything. People like him didn't see girls like her unless they wanted something. She had heard stories, she'd seen it happen to others, but there was also something about him that didn't fit the usual script. He hadn't laughed, he hadn't smirked, he'd apologized. Rich boys didn't usually apologize. Across town, Damilola sat by the large windows of his room, legs stretched out, untouched food on the table. The encounter replayed in his head in sharp, unexpected flashes. He could still hear her voice, feel the heat of her anger, and the quiet pride wrapped around her like armor. It was strange how someone selling a Kara had managed to rattle him more than any investor ever had. He tried to shrug it off, but his curiosity itched. Who was she? What was her name? He hadn't even asked. Lagos was big, and the chances of seeing her again were slim. But part of him wasn't ready to let it go. Not yet. The next morning, Amarachi woke earlier than usual. She needed to repair the table somehow and act like everything was normal. As she stepped out into the morning haze, her wrapper tied firm and her tray for akara balanced with what akara she could manage, a shadow moved across the street. It was him. Again. Damilola stood a few feet away, dressed far less intimidating than the day before. No sunglasses, no designer aura, just jeans and a shirt. He raised a hand, almost awkwardly. "I owe you more than money," he said, voice uncertain. Amarachi blinked, stunned. "Why are you here?" He smiled faintly. "Because yesterday didn't feel like the end." Amarachi didn't know whether to run or throw something at him. There he was again, this boy from another planet, standing like he belonged on her street. His clothes were simpler today, but the way he carried himself gave him away. He didn't belong here. She narrowed her eyes, heart beating too loud. "What do you want from me?" she asked, arms folded, guarding herself. Damilola looked at her with an honesty that felt dangerous. I don't know, he admitted, but I couldn't stop thinking about you. I guess I wanted to see if you'd talk to me. For real this time. Amarachi scoffed. Talk to you? Rich boys don't talk. They show up, make a mess, and vanish. What makes you different? That hit him harder than he expected. He shoved his hands into his pockets, shifting his weight. I don't want anything from you, he said. I just liked how you stood your ground. No one does that with me. A silence passed between them, charged, uncertain. Amarachi looked down at her fingers, at the oil stains and ash from her morning hustle. She wasn't used to boys looking at her like that, especially not ones with cars that cost more than her entire street. Against her better judgment, she tilted her head. You sure you want to talk to a girl who smells like firewood and beans? Damilola smiled. I smell like expensive boredom. You win. It made her laugh. A soft, reluctant laugh she didn't mean to let out. And for a moment it felt easy, almost normal, but it didn't last. As he reached to help her adjust her tray, a loud voice rang out across the street. Amarachi? Who be that one? You done turn celebrity. It was Mama Nkechi, the nosy neighbor who made it her business to know everyone else's. Heads were already turning. Amarachi stiffened. The weight of judgment, gossip, and reputation slammed down on her shoulders. You have to go, she whispered, panic creeping into her tone. They'll twist this. Please, just leave. Damilola hesitated, then nodded. Okay, but I'm not disappearing. She watched him walk away, heart caught between fear and something far more dangerous, hope. The next few days passed like a strange blur for Amarachi. Business continued, the streets remained noisy, and life carried on. But every time she flipped a kara in her pan, she caught herself glancing around, searching for the boy in jeans and quiet eyes. She told herself it was just curiosity, or maybe suspicion. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just that. She hadn't seen him since the morning the neighbors nearly ate her alive with their eyes. Still, the memory of his smile lingered like the smell of charcoal on her clothes. She didn't want it to, but it did. She hated how he'd left an imprint. Rich boys weren't supposed to make her heart beat funny. They were meant to pass by, untouched, like clouds in the sky. But Damilola hadn't forgotten either. He paced his room in Lekki, phone in hand, debating whether to return. His father had noticed his distraction and warned him, "Stay focused, Dami. You're not a child anymore. We don't have time for distractions." But Amarachi didn't feel like a distraction. She felt like a question he couldn't stop asking. On the third day, he showed up again. Amarachi saw him before he reached her stand and froze, hands covered in bean batter. He looked nervous. She didn't expect that. You really don't give up, do you? She asked, not sure if she was annoyed or amused. I said I wouldn't disappear, he replied. I meant it. They stood there for a moment, the street noise melting into the background. There was an unspoken pull between them now, stronger, undeniable. I still don't know why you're here, she said finally. Damilola took a slow breath. Maybe because you're the first person who's ever seen me without trying to impress me, or use me, or worship my last name. You looked at me like I was just a guy. Amarachi blinked, lips parting slightly. She hadn't expected honesty or softness. You talk like someone who's lonely, she whispered. Maybe I am. She didn't answer. But she didn't tell him to leave either. Sometimes the scariest kind of love is the one that tiptoes in. Not loud or dramatic, but quiet and real. For the first time in a long while, Amarachi let herself laugh freely. It was a small sound, tucked between the sizzling of a kara and the distant honk of impatient danfos. but it was real. Damilola stood by her side, awkwardly helping her turn the hot balls in the pan, his fingers trembling from the heat. "Omo, you rich boys are not built for this kind of suffering," Amarachi teased, smirking as he hissed from a minor burn. "I'm beginning to realize that," he muttered, shaking his fingers like a child. "But I think I'm improving." "You've burnt only 2 out of 5. That's not bad for a beginner," she said, eyes dancing. To anyone passing by, they looked like childhood friends sharing a joke, not two people from opposite worlds. Damilola had ditched the flash. No car, no expensive watch, just a plain shirt, jeans, and a shy curiosity in his eyes. Amarachi noticed, and that made her nervous. She wasn't used to people staying, especially not ones with options. Behind her confidence was still fear. Fear of getting used to him, of believing this was more than just a passing phase for him. People like Damilola didn't usually mean forever, but his presence was starting to feel familiar, warm even. "So," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead, "you make this much akara every morning?" "This much? You mean this little?" she corrected. "I used to make more, but since your Range Rover tried to assassinate my table," he laughed. A full, unguarded laugh that made a woman in the next stall turn to stare. Amarachi smiled too, trying not to like the way it sounded, but the moment was interrupted by a shadow. A black Benz pulled up by the curb. Damilola's older brother Tunji stepped out in a suit so sharp it could slice bread. His eyes swept the scene like a disapproving father. "Dami," he said flatly, "what on earth are you doing here?" The warmth vanished from Damilola's face. Amarachi's heart sank. She didn't know who the man was, but she recognized the tone, the kind that reminded people of where they didn't belong. And suddenly she wasn't sure if Damilola would keep choosing this side of the city. Tunji's presence was like a sudden cold wind. His gaze lingered too long on Amarachi, his lips curling ever so slightly as if her mere existence was offensive. He didn't speak to her, didn't acknowledge her greeting, just stared at his brother like Damilola had dragged the family name through mud. "You're late for your meeting," Tunji said flatly, eyes never leaving his brother. Father's furious. Damilola didn't move. "I'll come when I'm ready." Tunji's brow twitched just once. "You're playing a dangerous game. Come to your senses before this turns into something embarrassing." Then he turned, got into the Benz, and drove off. No goodbye, no apology, just silence left behind. Amarachi didn't speak for a while. She cleaned her hands, her back turned, her shoulders stiff. When she finally turned to him, her voice was calm, but there was something hard behind it. "That was your brother?" "Yeah," Damilola said, trying to smile. "He thinks he's my second father. He looked at me like I was dirt." "I'm sorry about that. He doesn't understand." Amarachi scoffed. "Number. He understands perfectly. I'm not from your world," he reminded me. Damilola stepped closer, but she didn't back away. "Don't let him get to you," he said. "This isn't his decision." "But it'll affect you," she said, locking eyes with him. "This, us, whatever it is, it won't be easy for you, and I'm not going to be your little secret." That hit him like a punch. He admired her honesty, her strength, but this was the first time he realized how much weight she carried. How hard it must be to let someone like him in, knowing it might never be safe. "I don't want to hide you," he said softly. "You say that now?" There was a pause. Then Amarachi sighed and looked away. "Go to your meeting," she said, "before your brother returns with a press release." Damilola didn't want to leave, but he nodded. As he walked away, he turned once and looked back. She was already wiping her table, pretending like she hadn't just given him a choice to make. And deep down, Damilola knew he would have to start choosing soon, between comfort and truth, between their world and hers. The air was thick with questions the next time they met. Damilola had missed 2 days, and Amarachi told herself she didn't care. But when he returned, no car, no loud entrance, just him with puff-puff and bottled water in hand, her heart betrayed her. She felt a relief before she could hide it.
"Thought you got tired of this side of town," she said without looking up from her pan.
"I didn't," he replied, offering her one of the puff-puffs. "I just had to do damage control with my father." Amarachi accepted the snack, but her hands paused. "What did you tell him?" "That I was seeing someone."
She turned to him, startled. "You told your father about me?"
He nodded. He didn't take it well. Said, "I'm throwing away my future for a fantasy."
Amarachi leaned back against the wall, puff-puff in hand, but no appetite left. "It is a fantasy, dummy. Let's not lie to ourselves. Your family has plans for you. I don't fit into them. You fit into my plans."
"But for how long?" Her voice trembled, not with the weakness, but with honesty. "What happens when the pressure becomes too much? When they threaten to cut you off, or worse, when they offer you someone better, a polished daughter from one of their boardroom friends?"
He looked wounded, but he didn't deny it.
She continued, voice steady. "I sell akara. I smell like smoke half the time. I've got 2 siblings I can barely feed, and I'm the one taking care of my mother. And I live in a 1-room apartment with a leaking roof. You're not built for this life."
"But I'm not asking to be saved from it," he whispered. "I'm asking to learn it with you." With their eyes staring romantically at each other.
That silenced her. For a long moment, the 2 of them stood there, the street buzzing around them, their hearts suspended between hope and harsh reality. Amarachi didn't know what scared her more, losing him or believing that maybe, just maybe, he meant it. "You're mad," she finally said, cracking a smile. "Maybe, but I like you." She looked away, hiding her smile. "Don't make promises your world won't let you keep."
But deep inside, something cracked open, quiet, cautious, and achingly alive.
The next time Damilola visited, he didn't come empty-handed. In a small bag slung over his shoulder were nails and small toolkit clearly unused, with his driver dropping off some wooden planks. Amarachi looked at him like he'd lost his mind.
"You're going to rebuild my table?" she asked, eyebrow raised.
He grinned. "Well, attempt to, with your supervision."
They worked side by side, him hammering clumsily, her correcting his grip, her laughter bubbling over when he hit his thumb for the 3rd time. For once, the talk wasn't about the difference in their worlds. It was about teamwork, tiny victories, and the joy of just being. They were sweaty, dusty, and entirely themselves.
"You know, you could have just bought me a new table," she said, taking a sip from her water bottle.
"I know," he replied, "but I wanted to build something with you, even if it's just wood and nails." Her heart skipped a beat. For someone who lived in a world of fast solutions, this gesture felt intentional, intimate.
As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, they sat together on the finished bench beside the new table, crooked but steady. Amarachi leaned her head on his shoulder without thinking, and Damilola didn't move. He just let her rest there, the silence between them speaking louder than words.
"I've been thinking," he said quietly, "maybe it's not about escaping our worlds, but building one that fits both of us."
She smiled faintly. "That sounds like a fairy tale." "Maybe, but what if we made it real, piece by piece?"
She thought about that, about starting small. She could keep selling her akara and he could meet her halfway, without the pomp, without the pressure. Maybe, just maybe, they could carve a corner of the world that didn't care about last names or bank accounts.
All right, she said, lifting her head. Let's start with you learning to fry akara properly. Then maybe we'll talk fairy tales. He laughed. Deal, but only if you promise not to laugh when I mess up. I can't make promises I won't keep, she teased. And in that golden hour, surrounded by the scent of oil, wood, and dreams stitched together by defiance, their love took its first deep root. Damilola didn't mind the grease under his nails anymore. He'd spent the past week helping Amarachi before his morning meetings, frying akara, fetching water, even learning how to handle stubborn customers. She teased him mercilessly, but every laugh they shared stitched him closer to her world. It wasn't just about love anymore. It was about belonging. But the world had a way of watching and talking.
It started small. Whispered comments from neighbors. Long stares from passers-by. Amarachi tried to ignore them. She had built her life around not caring what others thought. But deep down, it made her stomach twist. Not because she was ashamed, but because she knew how fast people could turn. Especially when you started doing things they didn't understand.
One afternoon, as they packed up her stall, a group of young men passed by. One of them snorted, loud enough to be heard. Ah, see love when you get future. When him papa call him back, we go see who go remain.
Damilola turned, jaw clenched, but Amarachi gently touched his hand. Leave it, she whispered. This is part of it.
Later that evening, as they sat in a quiet corner of a local suya spot, Damilola finally asked, "Do you regret this? Us?" She looked up from her drink. "No," she said. "But I do get scared. Every day. I've never had anything this good, Dami. And I don't know how to hold it without breaking it." He reached across the table, gently brushing his thumb over her knuckles. "Then let's hold it together." She bit her lip, eyes suddenly glassy. "We need a plan. Something real. We can't keep floating between moments." He nodded. "You're right. I've been thinking I could start a food truck. Something small, affordable. We use your recipes, your name on it. It won't solve everything, but it's a beginning." Amarachi stared at him, stunned. No man had ever offered her partnership. Only promises, temporary ones. "You're serious?" she asked. "Dead serious." A small smile tugged at her lips. "Then I guess we just might have a future, even if the world doesn't see it yet." In the glow of the soya stand's lantern, surrounded by spice and soft laughter, their love stopped being a secret and started becoming a promise. It was a Thursday afternoon when everything shifted. Amarachi was restocking her supplies at the local market when she got the call. An unknown number, crisp voice, unfamiliar tone. "Miss Amarachi Okonkwo, you've been invited to appear at Adebayo and Sons headquarters at 11 a.m. tomorrow. Mr. Adekunle Adebayo wishes to speak with you."
She froze in the middle of the onion section. Her breath caught, chest tightening. Why?
"No further information. Just the invitation." The line cut.
That night, she told Damilola everything. They sat quietly in the back of his car, parked far from the street lights. Amarachi's hands were cold, clenched tight in her lap.
"He wants to scare me off," she whispered. "Make me feel small."
"He won't," Damilola said, though his jaw was tight. "I'll go with you."
But Amarachi shook her head. "Number, if I show up with you, he'll think I'm hiding behind your name. If I walk in alone, he'll see I'm not a girl he can scare." Damilola looked at her, something fierce and helpless battling in his eyes. "You don't have to prove anything." "I do, not for him, for me."
The next morning, Amarachi stood outside the glass building, dressed in her cleanest clothes. Still simple, still hers. She walked through the doors, head held high, ignoring the way the receptionist's eyes widened. They led her to a private office where Mr. Adebayo sat behind a polished desk, his presence heavy, his expression unreadable.
"You're quite bold," he said without greeting. "Most girls in your position would have taken the money quietly and left." "I'm not most girls," she replied, voice steady. He leaned forward. "You think you can handle this life? My son's life? The press, the scrutiny, the burden of reputation?" Amarachi met his gaze. "I'm not here to defend myself. I came to tell you this. I love your son. And whether you approve or not, I'm not afraid of you."
There was silence. Then slowly, Mr. Adebayo pulled out an envelope and slid it across the table. "If you really love him," he said, "don't open this now. Open it after you've walked away." Amarachi stared at it. The weight of that envelope and everything it might contain sat heavy in her palm. And suddenly, the future didn't feel so certain. The letter burned in her bag the entire ride home. Amarachi didn't touch it. She couldn't. All through her walk back to Mushin, through the winding roads and familiar stairs, it felt like she was carrying something that could break her open. She waited until the compound was quiet, until the children were asleep, and the generator hum softened. She sat on her thin mattress, peeled open the envelope, and read. It wasn't what she expected. Inside was a typed letter, not harsh, not threatening, but cold and precise. Mr. Adebayo had offered her 10 million naira, not to leave Damilola, but to let him go, quietly, without drama. He claimed it was a gift to help her return to a life more suited to her background and to avoid the inevitable embarrassment her relationship with Damilola would bring. The words sliced her pride like paper cuts. She sat in silence, rereading them until her vision blurred. He hadn't threatened her. That would have been easier to fight. Instead, he'd made it a choice, a twisted one. She didn't sleep that night. By morning, the decision felt like a stone in her chest. When Damilola showed up with the same boyish grin, she couldn't return it. Not at this time. "I have to talk to you," she said, voice low. They walked behind her stall, where the walls kept them hidden. She handed him the letter. She didn't say anything while he read. His face changed, slowly, from confusion to anger to hurt. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, voice rough. "Because I didn't know what to do. I wanted to believe we could fight anything. But I've never had this much in front of me, Dami. Never. It's not just about money. It's about knowing that your father would rather pay me off than try to understand me." Damilola looked at her, his hands shaking slightly. "Are you going to take it?" Amarachi didn't answer. Her silence was louder than any yes. He nodded, stepping back as if she had slapped him. "So that's it?" "No," she whispered. "I don't want it. But I don't want to ruin your life either."
"You're not ruining anything. He is." They stood facing each other, two hearts aching, two worlds stirring. And for the first time, love didn't feel like enough.
Damilola didn't sleep that night. He lay awake in his room, staring at the ceiling, his mind pacing like a caged animal. The letter, the money, the silence between him and Amarachi. It all pressed down on him like the weight of the Adebayo name. He had never felt so torn, but he had never felt so sure either. His father had drawn a line in the sand. And now, he had to choose which side to stand on. By morning, he knew what he had to do. There was no driver, no polished look, just Damilola, dressed in a wrinkled t-shirt, eyes heavy with determination. He marched down the dusty street of Mushin, past the neighbors who stared with open mouths and stopped in front of Amarachi's Akara stand. She saw him coming and straightened up, the letter already burning a hole in her pocket. "We need to talk," he said. She led him behind the stand, into the narrow alleyway where the world couldn't watch them fall apart. Without a word, she handed him the envelope. He opened it, scanned the letter, and grew still. The weight of the 10 million naira offer was heavier than the ink on the paper. His jaw clenched. When he finally looked up, his eyes were darker than she'd ever seen them. "My father offered you this?"
She nodded, eyes downcast. "He said it was a gift, a gentle way to make me disappear. Are you considering it?" Her silence was loud.
"Amarachi?"
"It's not about the money," she whispered. "It's about the message. He thinks I don't belong, that I'm a stain on your future." Damilola stepped closer, frustration and pain dancing in his chest. "You're not a stain. You're the only real thing I've ever had."
"I don't want to be the reason you lose everything."
"Then let me decide what I'm willing to lose."
Before she could speak, he pulled out his phone and called his father. He put it on speaker.
"Damilola," came the familiar cold voice. "I assume you've spoken with the girl?" "I have. And I'm calling to tell you this. Keep your money. I love her. I won't let you buy your way between us."
"Be careful," his father warned. "This won't end well." "Maybe not, but it will end honestly."
He hung up and looked Amarachi straight in the eye. "I choose you, and I'll keep choosing you, even when it costs me." She couldn't stop the tears this time. They didn't come from fear. They came from finally being fought for. 3 days passed in quiet tension. Amarachi kept working. Damilola stayed by her side. And though their bond had never been stronger, there was still a shadow hanging over them. His father's silence. No one knew what would come next. Until one morning, a black SUV pulled up in front of her store. This time it wasn't Damilola's brother or a bodyguard. It was his mother.
Mrs. Adebayo stepped out gracefully, dressed in Ankara that shimmered under the sun. Her eyes scanned the street, then settled on Amarachi. Not with disdain, but something closer to curiosity.
"I'm looking for Miss Amarachi Okonkwo," she said.
Amarachi, wiping her hands, looked stunned. "That's me, Ma?"
The older woman smiled gently. "I believe we have much to talk about." They met at a small cafe nearby. No assistants, no cameras, just two women from different worlds. And for the first time, Amarachi felt like she was being seen, not judged. "My husband was harsh," Mrs. Adebayo began, "but I've watched you, quietly. I needed to see if this was infatuation or something deeper." Amarachi blinked. "And what did you decide?" "That your love has more backbone than most people's marriages, and that you've done something no one has managed to do. You made my son better." She reached into her bag and pulled out a sleek folder. Amarachi hesitated before opening it. Inside were business proposals, brand designs, a complete expansion plan for her Akara business into something bigger. Food trucks, a branded kiosk, social media marketing, a new kitchen. "We'd like to invest in you," she said, "not to change you, but to amplify what you've already built." Tears welled in Amarachi's eyes, but she swallowed them back. "Why?" she asked softly. Mrs. Adebayo smiled. "Because you're not a charity case, you're a powerhouse. And because Damilola's happiness starts with you." By the time Damilola arrived, Amarachi was still holding the folder, stunned. He froze when he saw his mother sitting beside her. "Mom?" he said, confused. Mrs. Adebayo stood, smoothed her wrapper, and kissed her son's cheek. "She's everything you said she was. Maybe more." As she walked away,
Amarachi finally exhaled. For the first time, the door didn't close on her. It opened.
The grand opening of Amarachi's Akara Delights was nothing like Amarachi had ever imagined. The store she once fought to protect her blossomed into a bright, modern food hub, complete with 2 food trucks, branded packaging, a social media page with thousands of followers, and a tiny staff that called her Madam Amarachi with wide smiles. The neighborhood watched in awe. Some cheered, a few whispered, but no one could deny the transformation. She hadn't just risen, she had redefined the climb. As she adjusted the strap of her apron and glanced at the queue stretching down the street, she caught sight of Damilola approaching, holding a bouquet of sunflowers. Her favorite, though she'd never told him out loud. He just knew. "You're late," she teased. "You're glowing," he said, grinning. "I'm sweating." He kissed her cheek. "You're glowing." They stood side by side behind the counter as the first customer walked up. A little girl with 2 missing teeth and eyes full of wonder. "Is it true you used to fry akara with firewood?"
Amarachi laughed, nodding. "It's still the same recipe, just new packaging."
After the rush slowed, they slipped into the back where Damilola handed her a small box. Amarachi blinked. "What's this?" "Something simple," he said. "Nothing flashy. I figured you've had enough drama for one lifetime." She opened the box. Inside was a silver necklace with a small pendant shaped like a frying pan. It was silly, sentimental, perfect. She laughed, tears stinging her eyes. "You're ridiculous."
"I know," he said, "but you love me."
"I do." He stepped closer, his voice quieter now. "So, what if we made it official? Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. You and me. A home, a life, built the way we want it." Her smile faded, replaced by something softer. "Real. Are you asking me to marry you?" "Not yet," he said. "I'm asking you to keep building this with me. One day, one laugh, one tray of akara at a time."
She nodded slowly, heartful. "Yes, to all of it." Outside, the sun dipped behind the rooftops, casting a warm golden light across the storefront that now bore her name. People gathered, music played, and somewhere in the distance a child yelled, "Madam Amarachi, your akara na gold." And she believed it, because this life, this love, was no longer a fantasy. It was hers. And from then on, they lived happily as one big family. Now that Amarachi has now blossomed in her business and her life was now better, she decided to lend help to people she knows were once like her. The love between her and Damilola flourished more with both families together. Damilola's brother Tunji, who was against their love before he apologized to his brother Damilola and Amarachi.
"I'm sorry for trying to hinder you both from loving each other. I now see that you both actually look good together." Damilola replied jokingly and said, "It's okay, my brother. What matters now is that we are together and everyone is happy." Amarachi added and said, "Uncle Tunji, don't worry, from now on, you'll enjoy Amarachi's golden akara." They all laughed. And that was the end of Amarachi's the roadside akara seller, daughter of a nobody who was struggling by herself with her akara business to take care of her family, and the rich Damilola, who had everything in a platters of gold, ended, with both of them loving each other forever.